So the movie's from 1949, and it's about daylight precision bombing of German-held Europe, 1942, 1943. And we're going to start it off with a promo by Gregory Peck, who was the star of the movie, about the introduction to the discussion.
After we looked at 12 o'clock high at the studio, I asked Darryl Zanuck's permission to tell you about it. I volunteered to do this because I believe that 12 o'clock high is a particularly fine picture. Because of its daring and exceptional honesty, it touches a new limit of human emotion and experience. It shows what actually happened to 12 men in one group of the 8th Air Force, what they had to take and how they took it. 12 men as their women never knew them. The role of Savage in 12 o'clock high is the most satisfying I've ever played. Savage is an exceptional personality who dares to be all things to 12 men. A man who crosses wings with destiny. But stop worrying about it and about yourselves. Stop making plans. Forget about going home. Consider yourselves already dead. Once you accept that idea, it won't be so rough.
On your toes, high squadron, low squadron, here they come. 12 o'clock high. Watch it, Cobb, they're heading for the high squadron.
Because 12 o'clock high is good, powerful entertainment. I urge you not to miss it. Thank
you. Okay, this is basically how I'm going to organize the presentation. If you look here, talk about the origins and of the Army Air Corps, the Bomber Mafia, the B-17 Fortress, and preparations for making the film. Talk about some accuracies. I always like to refer to this as, is it real or is it Hollywood? And then do some discussion and summary at the end. Now, that thing you just watched was a lot of ballyhoo, as they call it, I guess, in Hollywood. It talked about how their women never knew them, and that's okay because you're not going to know either, because there are no women in this movie except for one. She's a nurse. She has about 6 lines, and that's it. This is all about men. They're all white men because that's what the 8th Air Force was at the time. It was not integrated. And I don't know if you could make this kind of movie today. It would be very difficult, I think. Here's some background. Made in 1949. That's a little over 73 years ago. But if you've watched it lately, it still holds up. It's a good movie. It's very entertaining. It's in contrast to another movie of the time, 1948, Command Decision, which had a lot of star power in it. It had Clark Gable, Walter Pidgeon, Brian Dunleavy, Van Johnson, John Hodiak. At the time, very major stars. But it was basically a stage play that was filmed. And there was a lot of dialogue, but very little action, and there was a lot of angst about should we be doing daylight bombing, should we not, is it too, are we going to lose too many people? And the same kind of theme is carried on in 12 o'clock high, but in a little bit different way. Give you some background on this. The Army Air Corps, First Army plane was a Wright Flyer, and the instructors were Orville and Wilbur. They were actually giving the instructions to the pilots, the lieutenants usually, and the Signal Corps. As part of the Signal Corps, that's the way the Army saw it. This is a good way to deliver messages and maintain contact with people. When the pilots were graduated, they not only got their graduation certificate, they were also given a toolkit because they were expected to maintain their engines themselves. The Army view of aviation for a long time was merely a supportive of the infantry operations that were going on as part of the Signal Corps. By World War I, the U.S. used French and British planes primarily. The only thing we had was the Curtiss Jenny, mainly, for training here in the United States. Also note that in World War I, Britain was bombed 52 times by the Germans, both dirigibles and fixed-wing planes, the Gotha and the Giant bombers. The U.S. Air Service of the Army Air Corps was used some British, but mostly French fighters. So those are on the left over there, a British fighter and a Finnish fighter. The 94th Aerial Squadron, Hat in the Ring Squadron, was in combat only from May through November of 1918. Makes it sound like we're in World War I for the entire operation, but in reality we were only there about 7 months. They used French and a U.S.-made British design, the DH-4 over on the right, were used for bombing, or for bombing missions. The Germans had the dirigibles, and they had the Gotha, that's the one on the right, and at the bottom you see a Zeppelin Giant bomber, and that's got 4 engines, and it looks like it only has 2, but that's because the engines the nuclei are actually push-pull, which is another design that's going to come in World War II, and later on the Skymaster was a FAC airplane in Vietnam. So, here are 3 aircraft, 2 bombers and a fighter that typify what the U.S. Combat aviation was like in the 1930s. Up in the upper left is a P-26 Pea Shooter from 1933. If you look at that, you'll notice there's no cockpit. It's just a windscreen in front of a pilot sitting in a seat with his hair blowing in the wind. On the right's a Martin B-10 medium bomber of 1934, and they're pretty well open to the elements as well. Down the bottom left is a B-18 1935, and that beat out the Boeing contender for the contract they were looking for at that time. And on the right, we've got the Pea Shooter and a B-26 flying in formation together. You get an idea. This is what aviation looked like in early 1933 for the U.S. Army Air Corps. Now, after World War I, there was a meager sustainment of military in general and aviation in particular. The U.S. main aim was the interception of ships, which Army Brigadier General Billy Mitchell demonstrated could be sunk by our air power alone. Also, the British politician Stanley Baldwin, who was 3 times the Prime Minister of Britain, gave in a speech in 1932 and prophetically stated that bombers will always get through. And a lot of the Army aviators who were bomber pilots took that to heart. The Army aviators, the theory grew, air power alone can win the war. There were only modest improvements in interwar years. And by the late 1930s, the U.S. Army Air Force was ranked 5th in the world. And it's 5th only because a lot of countries didn't even have an Air Force. So that's why we're still number 5. We had about 1,200 planes, and most of those were obsolete. Here's a picture of Billy Mitchell. The right side of the screen, you'll see the 2 battleships that were sunk during the trials in 1921 to see what could happen if you took an Army bomber out. The Navy said, well, the anti-aircraft would have knocked the bombers out of the sky. And the aviators thought maybe so, maybe not. Billy Mitchell, though, had pushed hard, and his outspokenness got him a court-martial in 1926, and he wound up leaving the Army. But he was pushing that air power alone could win the war, and you wouldn't have to have ground forces. I mentioned Stanley Baldwin. This is Stanley Baldwin, and his main quote was, "The bombers will always get through." And England experienced a lot of that. I mentioned the bomber mafia was almost a cult or religion beliefs of the importance of aviation. These were members of the Air Tactical School at Maxwell Airfield, which is now Maxwell Air Force Base near Montgomery, Alabama. On the left-hand side there, the top one that you see. These things were far from the headquarters brass up in Washington and from the other parts of the aviation that were at Langley, Virginia. That's where you find, and still today, you find a lot of the Air Force headquartered. When we deploy a wing, it usually comes out of Langley as the first one to deploy. 3 other sites are on this map just because we have the map here. First on the bottom right, the 8th Air Force was initiated in Savannah, Georgia. We talked about that, and that's where the museum is now in Pooler, Georgia, just outside Savannah. And on the left-hand side are the 2 locations where this film was filmed. On the bottom is Eglin Air Force Base, Florida, and on the middle there is Ozark, Alabama, which is now known better as Fort Rucker. As mentioned, the Air Corps Tactical School, or ACTS. If you look on this slide, you'll see the instructors on the left, and you may notice some names, and they can link them up with Air Force bases. For example, George Air Force Base. One of the key instructors, the leading theorist, was Harold George. Also, you have Haywood Hansel there. Look down that list, you see Otis Moon and, Robert Olds. Now, Robert Olds is the father of Robin Olds, who actually was Robert Olds Jr., but his nickname became Robin. And he was actually an ace from World War, his son, was an ace in World War II and in the Vietnam War. On the right are some of the graduates. Again, you may look at some of the names and you're going to see them show up again. Frank Andrews, Hap Arnold. Hap Arnold was in charge of the entire air operations in World War II. Jimmy Doolittle, Ira Aker. Who else do we have on there? Curtis LeMay and Vandenberg, Hoyt Vandenberg. These are some of the pictures of the people I just mentioned. Up in the upper left, Ira Aker and Jimmy Doolittle. Also Hayward Hansel, General Hap Arnold down the bottom right in the middle. Okay, and Carl Spaatz, also a commander of the Air Forces in Europe. And on the right, it looks like Curtis LeMay is about ready to fight somebody right there in that picture, doesn't it? Any questions right now on background for the Army and the Army Air Corps about how it was starting to develop? It's been part of the Signal Corps, it stayed part of the Signal Corps, and finally became the Army Air Corps in the late 1926. Okay. Talk about the plane they flew, which is the B-17. We all know the B-17. There were two bombers, the B-17 and the B-24, but it seems like B-17 had better press from Boeing and gets most of the love. Probably the most recognizable bomber from World War II, designed and made by Boeing Company in Seattle. It was the first truly modern 4-engine heavy bomber. It was all metal and used a mono wing. In 1933, the Army had a competition for a new multi-engine bomber to replace the B-10. Douglas and Martin, in addition to Boeing, were part of that competition, but Douglas and Martin only provided twin-engine designs. Boeing had a 4-engine model. It was its Model 299. The Army Air Corps specs for that competition were carry a useful bomb load at an altitude of 10,000 feet for 10 hours with a top speed of 200 miles per hour, although we would like to have a top speed of 250 miles an hour, and a range of 2,000 miles. The only reason Boeing did not win that competition was because the Boeing 299 crashed, and the contract went to the B-18, the Douglas B-18 Bolo. But the Air Corps still liked that design, and they ordered 23 Y-1B-17s to test. Now, the Army Air Corps concept of strategic bombing now was starting to develop. The way, again, like I said, they wanted to see that there would be no ground fighting. They would simply be bombing, and they would bomb the centers of economic interest of the enemy. This was resisted heavily by the mainstream Army, and the goal was to eventually become a co-equal service with the Army and the Navy. Talking about the B-17, in the upper left you see the Model 299 in flight, and you see what it looked like after the crash, and the crash was because they forgot to take out the control locks. So as the plane tried to take off, it didn't go anywhere. This also led to the use of pre-flight checklists on airplanes at this time. And the Y-1B-17 is shown on the right. And you notice it doesn't look like the B-17 that most of us know from World War II. Come on. There we go. The name came from a newspaper reporter who saw that the 5 machine guns on the B-17, and then he looked at it and said, "Wow, that looks like a flying fortress." And the name stuck. Boeing liked it, and they played it up. Originally, the B-17 had 5 30 caliber machine guns, but it was later to fight off enemy bombers. But the later models had as many as 13 50 caliber machine guns on board each plane. The speed, load, range, both the combat range and the ferry range and the ceiling are shown on the chart here. This thing could go at 4,000 miles, but if you're going to go out, you have to come back, so 2,000 miles was its operational range. And it carried a bomb load of about 4,800 pounds. I got it up to 8,000 pounds, but I don't think it ever really got much more than 4,800 pounds is the maximum bomb load it would carry. Note on ceilings, these planes were not pressurized, and that's something that everybody has to remember. If we jump on an airplane now, we zip off at 30,000 feet, and we're in a pressurized aluminum tube. These planes were open to the elements, so the oxygen had to be worn above 10,000 feet. You had to have an oxygen mask or you were going to die. And the temperatures were minus 50 degrees, so you better have on some heavy clothing, maybe electrically heated, and you better have gloves for your hand or your hand was going to stick to whatever metal it touched. Only a few of the early bombers were ordered. They were mostly sent to Britain, and they were there to close what was known as the air gap. The middle of the ocean between the U.S. and England was an area known as the Pit, or the Black Pit sometimes, and they were using long-range bombers to try to get out as far into that as they possibly could and reduce what was called the air gap for where the submarines were operating. So these are early B-17s. Original B-17s were very unlike the ones we know, as I said. These are B's, C's, and D models. They had no tail gun. Note the bathtub on the bottom of the bomber. Now this is how the gun position they had to engage behind and underneath the bomber. Also note the vertical tail fin it has. It's referred to sometimes as a shark fin. B-17D on the right was at Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines at the start of the war. Its name was Old Betsy at first, but it was changed to the Swoos, named after a song of that time called, it was a combination swan and a goose, so it became the Swoos. And that's now at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio for restoration. Predominant models were the E, F, and Gs. The E's had the large dorsal fin that we know now that distinguishes B-17, had top and belly turrets and tail guns. The U.S. Air Force's first type were used that we used in Germany against Germany in 1942 and 1943. The F model brought on the plexiglass nose, two machine guns also sticking out of the sides of the front of the nose, and fuel and engine modifications. Also the beginning of subcontracting from Boeing to Douglas and Vega, part of Lockheed. And finally is the B-17G. This is the most prominent model that was made. Predominant model that was made. It's noted by its chin turret and also had internal refinements. Now of all the B-17s, 12,731 were built. This is the third most produced bomber in World War II. By models, the E's had about 512, the F's had about 3,400, and the G's overwhelmingly had 8,680. 37% of all the B-17s were lost in combat, about 4,700 planes, and that means about 47,000 men went down with them. And hopefully you were able to grab a parachute and get out of it for some of them. These are examples of the E's and F's. These were the first types used in the war over Europe. The bottom right is the original Memphis Belle that completed 25 missions and was returned to the U.S. for a war bond tour. It was not the first one to complete 25 missions. That was Hell's Angels, but this I think was the second or third one. The reason the Memphis Belle is immortalized is because of William Wilder, who was taking film at the time, and he concentrated on the Belle because I guess he had more film and sort of liked it better. An aside was the pilot of the Belle asked him one time, said, what would have happened if we'd gotten shot down on that 25th mission? He says, that's okay, I had plenty of film of Hell's Angels as well. That was the first one to complete 25 missions. B-17Gs were the most produced variant, and the Gs are easily distinguished by their conspicuous chin turret, which is operated by the bombardier through a mechanical link. Now, what were the positions on the plane? There were 10 men on this airplane. As I said, crew of 10. From front to rear, they are the bombardier, who sits in the nose of the airplane through that plexiglass nose right above that chin turret. Slightly behind him is the navigator, who has a desk where he was able to work, a very small desk. Behind them and slightly back and above is the cockpit, where the pilot on the left and the co-pilot on the right sit. Behind them is a flight engineer, and his secondary job is he's the top turret gunner. And then you come to the bomb bay. The bomb bay carried 4,400 pounds to 4,800 pounds, 4,800 pounds of bombs. Bombs are stacked horizontally on either side of a catwalk, a small beam about a foot and a half wide, and down the middle of the plane. And that's how you got from the front of the plane to the rear of the plane in flight. You would walk on that little catwalk of metal. That would bring you to the radio man, who sat in the middle of the plane and operated the single gun that faced up and back, as you see it there just above his position. Next were the ball turret gunner on the bottom of the plane. And then there were the two waist gunners that fired out of the sides of the plane. And finally, at the rear, the lonely guy was the tail gunner, who sat in the very back of the plane. Now, what made this all happen was the fact that also developed with the B-17 was a Dutchman named Norden, Professor Norden, who came up with the Norden bomb sight. Norden bomb sight has 64 factors that it adjusts to be able to bring the drop of the bomb to wherever you want it to be, wherever you put the crosshairs through its little telescope on the ground. And one of those factors that it took into consideration was that from 20,000 feet, it would take over 2 minutes for the bomb to hit the ground, and during that 2 minutes, the Earth is rotating. So it compensated for that by determining how many feet the Earth would rotate in that 2-minute drop, so that it would adjust to where the bomb would hit the target. So 64 factors were being analyzed. It was an analog computer, just like a slide rule, or anybody a pilot in here? So if you're a pilot, you may have heard of a thing called an E6B. If you're a private pilot, it's a little calculator. You tell it one factor and spin it around, and next thing you know, you get your answer of what the thing would be. This is the same as that. It's just its big brother with a lot more factors. They had two gyroscopes, one in each one of those two parts of the unit. One that were stabilized and kept where the location of the airplane was. And this thing worked best if, when you went to what's called the initial point, the start of the bomb run, that you stayed on the bomb run. You stayed straight and level, didn't vary, didn't take evasive action. Then you could probably try to get your crosshairs on the target. Even so, the accuracy was questionable. That as many people went through there. They always said you could put a bomb in a pickle barrel, but in this case, from 20,000 feet. But this pickle barrel, sometimes it could be as much as 5 miles off when some of these bombs were dropped. So now these are two of the other defensive positions on the gun: the top turret on the top there, and the ball turret on the bottom. Flight engineer manned the top turret. That spins around 360 degrees, and the guns elevate to the vertical and to the horizontal. On the bottom, you have the ball turret. And the B-17, the ball turret was fixed. On the B-24, because it was so low to the ground, the ball turret was retractable. Not so in the B-17. Now, the gunner would not be in the ball turret when the plane took off. He would, as you usually got close to the enemy coast, the ball turret gunner would enter the ball turret. If you look on the right, you see the position the ball turret gunner would be in. Now those guns will go vertical, which means he's going to roll up in that ball with his legs up about where his ears are, and he'll stay in that position for 6 to 8 hours while the plane flies the mission. And also, you're having two 50 caliber machine guns. Everybody ever heard a 50 caliber machine gun go off? That's going off next to his head every time he fired it. Once he was in there, he almost could not get out of that thing by himself. It required you to roll the gun to the guns to be directly down. Then you could open the door and allow him to get back up in the fuselage of the airplane. If those gears stuck, he was stuck down in that ball turret. And some of the ball turret gunners were killed because they had to belly in, because the gear wouldn't come down. There was no way to get them out of the ball turret. These are the two waist gunners on the position of the B-17 in the middle. The middle photograph was on the cover of Life. If you see standing there, just a flak jacket or a flying jacket on, his leather helmet, and the plane is almost pristine in there. So that's what a magazine cover would look like. On the left and right are gunners who are actually portraying how it would be in combat. The right photo shows a gunner wearing a flak vest or apron, which was armor protection against bullets and shrapnel. And on the right, note the expended casings on the floor of the B-17. So you'd build up a lot of brass that you're slipping and sliding on as you're trying to aim this gun. And next is next to the ball turret gunner, the loneliest position on the plane was the tail gunner. Gunner sat or knelt facing the rear of the plane. He sighted along a sight bar to aim his guns, which were connected by mechanically to the twin 50 caliber machine guns he had down below him on the tail. What you see in that middle photograph, that's where he either sat or could kneel down there, and those are the two guns protruding in front of him. And that's his bar to control it above him. Now, the nemesis of the B-17 on the German side were the anti-aircraft guns, cannon, and the enemy aircraft. Flak, F-L-A-K, came from the German name for the anti-aircraft gun, the Flugabwehrkanone. It's 88 millimeter shells, effective range up to 37,000 feet. And B-17s early in 42 and 43 faced the Bf-109E and the Messerschmitt, and the FW-190 models A4 and A5 Focke-Wulf. That's a Focke-Wulf on the bottom and a Messerschmitt on top. And that's a picture of the German flak gun on the left side. And when the flak came up, well, maybe it did. When the flak came up, little black flowers blossomed, and each one of those is an explosion that's throwing shrapnel all over the sky. And that's not good for airplanes. So if a bomber got hit, the battle damage could be disastrous, as in these two pictures here. But the B-17 was rugged and tough and could take heavy punishment and still safely return its crews to bases in Britain. These are ones that actually made it back. If the plane was hit, you wanted to get out, but most of the time you had a harness on, but you didn't wear the parachute. You kept it close by because it was a very confining space in a B-17. Anybody's ever been in a B-17, you'll know what I'm talking about. And you kept your parachute nearby. For example, the ball turret gunner, there was no way he could get a parachute in that little turret with him, so his was back up in the airplane. So that meant he had to get out of the ball turret if he was going to jump from that airplane. Some people, like the bombardier, possibly could wear the B-7 backpack type. It was a little too confining probably for the pilot, co-pilot. And then you had to, if you moved around the airplane, it could be very restrictive for you. But these are the two type chutes they had, primarily the chest chute on the left, and then the backpack type on the right. The chest chute, as I said, was grabbed by the crewman, and if you look on the back of it, the bottom photograph there are two snap hooks, and he had two D-rings on the front of his harness. He would simply pop that thing in, and that would attach him to it, and now you go out of the airplane and pull the ripcord. Okay, this is a GIF, and you just watch it for a second, and you'll see it tries to show you where the locations of the different flight of V's, V of 3 airplanes are. This is a bomber box, trying to get the maximum number of defensive guns to engage attacking fighters. They're staggered horizontally and vertically, and planes flew about 100 feet apart. That's pretty close for these big airplanes. And if you watch, it'll show you, for example, right now it's showing number 4, Coffin Corner, sometimes referred to as the Coffin Corner. That was the low group, and in the back. The forward element was up above, and it had a group of planes above and below it, and then finally the Coffin Corner below them. Here's another look at a bomber box, if you're looking up into it. And finally, why they were there was to drop those bombs, and that's what it looks like when they pickled them out. The bomber manually flipped a switch to release the bombs, and initially all bombardiers targeted through their Norden bomb sights and released when the crosshairs hit the target. But later, the lead bombardier sighted, and while the others sighted, they released their bombs only when the lead ship did his. So they weren't always trying to target the same thing. And that's a B-17. Are there any questions I can answer about that? Or try to? Yes, sir.
I was just curious, what are the statistics on how many kills the waist gunner, the turret gunner, and the rear gunner had with the 50 caliber machine guns? Is there any?
I don't know if any. We were talking earlier about luck. This is luck of the draw. I mean, you could be in one of these, and the man behind you could be hit, and you could be perffly fine.
No, I mean, how many Messerschmitts did they shoot down? Those guys?
That I don't know.
Okay.
But Dan?
No, I had another question.
Okay. Well, I really don't know the answer. There was one thing. A Messerschmitt goes down. Let's say a 109 goes down. 5 planes would have their gunners say, "I got that guy."
Yeah.
And so the numbers reported when they came back and did their debriefings,
Right.
we were shooting down hundreds of these airplanes, more planes than the Germans had. And they had to try to finally figure out who was the one that was actually giving that was true. And did he actually shoot it down? They were given credit for destroyed or partials or damaged. And they needed verification from someone else that they saw the plane explode or they saw the plane actually hit the ground. Dan, your question.
If you're 100 feet apart, 50 caliber can go significantly further than.
It's called.
Did the waist gunners have to stop? I mean.
It's called friendly fire, and you had to know what your background was. And I'm sure we were tracking a Focke-Wulf, for example. The planes would come in, and then they would actually attack, usually from a higher altitude because they come faster. And usually they would roll themselves in and go vertical as they came in because it gave them more speed, and they didn't lose the consciousness when they went through like that. And they would slice right through the formation trying not to hit anybody. Until late in the war there was a group that did that. Their job was to hit the airplanes. But as they're firing, the gunners would take the target, and they would have to know if they were going to come down to where one of our bombers was in the background. And this is a friendly fire thing. You've got to be very careful what your background is to know where your overspray is going. So there's one of those things. The fighters left. When the fighters left, that was bad because that meant the cannon, the flak was going to start. And so as long as the fighters were there, you knew you were safe from flak. But you had to fight them off from the positions that they were in each one of the bombers. They had pretty good coverage. We're going to talk a minute about the name of the movie and what that's all about in a second. All right. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Was the Norden bomb site really successful? I have read a lot of things and it was not.
Well, the consensus is probably it was not as successful as everybody, the press that it was given. You could not actually put that bomb in the pickle barrel from 20,000 feet, but you could get it pretty close. There was a British report, the Butt report, that was done on British bombing, and they figured they were lucky if they would get 20% of the bombs within 5 miles of the target. And that was night bombing. They were carpet bombing because they just went to a city and dropped their loads. We were trying to do precision bombing and hit a specific target on the ground without hitting anything else around it. And even ours was not as accurate as they wanted it to be. And that was one of the questions. That is part of the movie. Is daylight precision bombing worth the cost of the losses that we're going to incur? And they continued to do it, and actually it did have results in that we gained air superiority before the invasion of the continent, which is one of the main efforts that they wanted, was stop take out all the fighter aircraft and anybody that could stop us, have air superiority before we could invade on Normandy. Okay. These are the preparations, movie preparations. These are 5 areas I'm going to talk about. First is the company that produced this was 20th Century Fox, and Darryl Zanuck was the vice president for production, so he was the producer of this thing. It cost about $1.5 million to make, which in 1949 was a lot of money. It grossed about $6.2 million on 14 million ticket sales. And you start to think like, what? And that's because in 1949, 1950, a movie cost 25 to 50 cents to see this movie. Okay. This is the concepts and focus of the movie. It's a story about our early entry into World War II and the theory of daylight precision bombing. It centers on the bomber group that's got poor morale, high losses, and is not getting the hits it needs with this bombing. The focus is on leadership, duty, courage, and perseverance through a stressful situation. Now, the key themes in it are daylight precision bombing. What is it? Why are we doing it? Is it worthwhile? And then maximum effort, and leadership, and then mental illness. I'll go into each one of these a little bit later on. First, the name of the movie. Many people, when you say, what, 12 o'clock, it's high noon. Hey, no, that was Gary Cooper. That's high noon. This is 12 o'clock high. So, when a plane is flying, the direction of flight is 12 o'clock. 3 o'clock is his right, 9 o'clock is his left, and 6 o'clock is his back. You may hear somebody sometimes refer to the thing, check 6, i.e. look behind you. That's why he's saying check 6, look behind you at the 6 o'clock time. Also, you had low, level, and high. This helped the gunners know where to look for their targets. So you would say enemy fighters, enemy bandits at 12 o'clock high. Now, 12 o'clock high was probably one of the most dangerous positions. First, the closing speed is now the combination of the speed of the airplane coming toward you and your speed going toward him, so it's a short period of time. Second, the only place that you can get an engagement on the bandit coming from 12 o'clock high is the top turret gunner or from another airplane. And second, what he's going to hit, the enemy gunner, what he's going to hit when he shoots at you is going to be the flight deck, the bombardier, or the navigator. So that's why 12 o'clock high is most dangerous. That's where the Germans like to attack from. Meant, like I said, fast closing speed, fewer guns firing on the target, and very susceptible targets to be hit. At a minimum, a head-on attack, front and above, could disrupt the formation and spoil the bomber's aim. Bernie Lay, who was one of the authors of the book and also one of the screenwriters' wife, was the one who suggested at a minimum, a head-on attack, as I said, could disrupt the formation and spoil the bomber's aim, so that's what they tried for. And Bernie's wife suggested, after Cy and Bernie were talking about German fighter attacks, she says, that sounds like a good name for a movie, 12 O'Clock High, because he would talk about them coming in from 12 o'clock high. So that brings us to who wrote the script for this thing. The movie is from the book by Lay and Bartlett, Cy Bartlett. The director, Henry King, also worked on the story, but he's not credited. Lay has quite the background. He was an Army pilot 1932 to 1935. He resigned his commission in 1935. He was a civilian writer, editor, and book and screenplay writer. He wrote the screenplay for from his book, I Wanted Wings, which was an early 1930s movie about the Air Force and being a fighter or being a pilot. He rejoined the Army Aviation in 1939, and in 1940 he was on Hap Arnold's staff for media relations, and later he was on the 8th Army staff. He deployed early to Britain. He was co-pilot in the 100 bomb group's raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg raid, and he returned to the U.S. to form and train a B-24 group. He deployed that group in 1944. Was shot down on his 4th mission. He parachuted to safety. He returned to England by way of the French resistance, and they would not let him fly again because he knew too much about the French resistance. Bartlett, who's a Ukrainian, which is kind of prophetic right now, we've got Ukraine in the news, was a journalist and screenwriter for RKO. He joined the Army Air Force film unit and became an aide to Carl Spaatz, commander of the U.S. European Air Forces. He was friends with Lay and proposed they write the book and movie after the war. Director Henry King was well known in Hollywood. He was one of 36 founders of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. He did 98 films over 47 years, from 1917 to 1962. He was nominated twice for Best Director, but he never won. 7 of his films were nominated for Best Picture, but none of them ever won. So you had pretty capable people who were setting this movie up. Now, many actors were considered for the role of Brigadier General Savage. Some were offered the role but declined it. Even Peck initially declined it until he heard King was going to direct, and King showed him some script changes. Leigh and Bartlett based many of their characters on real persons from the air war in Europe. And I've got to ask you just have to get your imagination working and think about John Wayne as Brigadier General Savage. Could you see that kind of dialogue in there? You know, well, Pilgrim, looks like we're going to have to go down to Germany again. So, the 306 bomb group was the group this was based on. You take the number 3, you multiply 306 by the number 3, and you get the 918th bomb group. So that's how they named the bomb group that was there. The actual person is on the left, the character that is being portrayed is in the middle, and the actor is on the right. So Gregory Peck is actually filling in for a real Colonel Frank Savage, who was one of the first people to control one of the bomb groups and take the 306 into Germany. Charles Overacre was Colonel Keith Davenport, played by Gary Merrill. Lieutenant General Ira Aker was Major General Ben Pritchard. That's Millard Mitchell, been there, you see him in a lot of movies. The Ben Gately character, who was supposed to be the cowardly guy that eventually came forward as a heroic guy, was a fictitious person put in there, played by Hugh Marlowe. Colonel William Stovall was actually the model for Major Harvey Stovall, the lawyer turned now adjutant that was played by Dean Jager, who actually won a Academy Award as Best Supporting Actor for this. The doctor, played by Paul Stewart, who was with the Mercury Theater and Orson Welles, was a well-known connection with them, was the doctor. That was a fictional character they wrote into it. Major Joe Cobb was actually supposed to be Paul Tibbets. That was the model for that. And I think Tibbets did something later in the war. Wasn't he known for something maybe in 1945? Didn't he do something there? I think, the Enola Gay. That's right, Hiroshima. So Tibbets was active in Europe first, and then eventually took over the B-29 operation. Then the clerk driver was in there. There was a Sergeant Donald Blevins. And finally, a RAF, the research I did gave me 2 versions of this, but one of them was the RAF guy was the Jesse Bishop character. I like that name too, by the way. But it was played by Robert Patton. And Robert Patton was actually a navigator in World War II. And he was the only one in this movie that had combat experience in an airplane. So, but Jesse Bishop was the guy who was supposed to have to fight off his pilot who had been hit and was having a problem, and fly the airplane, and did that for like an hour and a half to be able to get the plane back to the base. Now, evolution of the Air Force, need to throw this in. We started out, we said, as an aeronautical division in the Signal Corps early in 1907. It wound up as an aviation section from 1914 to 1918. And then it became the Air Services U.S. Army 1918 to 1926, and was called the Army Air Corps from 26 to 41. Then it became the U.S. Army Air Forces until 1947, when the National Defense Act of 1947 made it a co-equal partner with all the other services, and we now have the Army, Navy, and Air Force. Marines took a little longer to become co-equal because they were still part of the Navy. This also was the 1947 act that also desegregated the services. Now, Air Force assistance in making this thing could not have been made without the use or help of the U.S. Air Force. And the U.S. Air Force was seeking publicity for its role in World War II. The Air Force gladly cooperated with film, providing 12 B-17s. Now, 5 of those 12 B-17s, however, were flown remotely over atomic tests in Bikini Atoll. So when the flight crews on these were flying them, they had to limit their time because of radiation. Outside sets were built at Eglin Air Force Base Auxiliary Field number 3. It's called Duke Field. Used to be the home of Red Horse. That's the Air Force engineers. When they built this at that field during 1949, they built Quonset huts, a control tower, and other buildings for the base, like the hospital. And they did not use that for a lot of the filming of the things like takeoffs and landings, because in England they had dark runways or black runways. And they found that at Ozark Field, which is abandoned and not in use in 1949, up in Ozark, Alabama. Later, Ozark Field became Fort Rucker, or part of the Fort Rucker complex. Now, themes in this thing were 4 key themes. Daylight precision bombing was the holy grail of the so-called bomber mafia that said we can use this to win wars, we can hit just the specific target we want and not incur any other damage. They insisted they could win the war alone through the precise targeting of choke points in German industries such as oil or transportation, etc., or the production effort. And that's why the Schweinfurt raid was all about ball bearings. Everything worked on ball bearings, and they were trying to take that out. Regensburg was a sort of a diversion, and we could talk a long time about if that didn't go off because of weather and some other instances and became a kind of a disaster. I also talked about the term maximum effort for both men and machines. It was an undefined limit. Both were pushed to the breaking point, and fortunately the U.S. had the industrial might to produce 295,000 total airplanes, not just B-17s, but all airplanes. 31,000 of those were heavy bombers like the B-17 and the B-24. Also, the film is about leadership. This was used by the Air Force and the Navy into the 1960s to teach leadership. How do you take a broken unit and fix it and lead it into being a good unit? And finally, one of the themes was mental illness. In World War I, it was known as shell shock. In World War II, it was combat fatigue. And from Korea on now, we called it post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And it's now recognized as a wound to be treated and possibly prevented. This was also known at that time to the doctors in the 8th Air Force, but they were having a hard time deciding how to handle this. There was only so much that people could take, and they had to find out when and how that line would be crossed. So, back to one of my favorite things about these things, and this, is it real or is it Hollywood? So B-17 belly landing in the opening scenes of 12 O'Clock High. You see the plane swooping in over the grass. There are a couple of tents in there, personnel tents, and he swoops right through those and then puts it on the ground. Now, a lot of B-17s returned to base with serious battle damage, and while not common, the belly landings did occur. Often not by choice, of course. But in this one, the stunt flyer, Paul Mantz, was paid $4,500. Now that's about, I think, the equivalent of about $100,000 today to do this stunt. The Air Force was not pleased about this, but they allowed it to happen and were accepting of the damage to the B-17 because it was part of the script and something they thought had to be done. The first ball bearing factory that the raid took place on, and see the second point there, took place in August of 1943, so we were well past is this something we're going to do, daylight precision bombing. By that time, the U.S. numbers had grown and daylight precision bombing was the norm. This raid was sent out 376 B-17s, split between the aircraft plant at Regensburg and the ball bearing plant at Schweinfurt. 60 planes were lost during that operation, primarily because the timing was off because of weather. One group took off, the other group stayed on the ground and went off at a later time, allowed the fighters to go down, rearm and refuel, and come back up and get the second group, which is they were supposed to have been drawn off by that. One of the things too they had to decide was, hey, this is should we do this in black and white or color? And black and white was used for both invoke the period of World War II and to blend the black and white aerial combat footage seen at the end of the film. And I think they actually did that. Doing it in color would probably have not made it as realistic as it was in the black and white. And that brings us kind of to a conclusion here. So that's 12 O'Clock High. 73 years old. I think it's still a good movie. And let me see, you can drop some questions on me if you want to.
The mug.
Questions?
I got a question. What-
John.
Were there any books, or did Lay ever write a book about the guy that parachuted and was captured by the French resistance? He sounds like quite a fellow.
Bernie Lay,
Books
that-
or movies made about him?
No, they never made a story of Bernie Lay's life,
That's
life.
fascinating.
Dan.
The mug.
So,
Mug, you were going to explain the mug.
oh, the mug. Okay. Okay. I'll explain the mug. The mug here that you see at the front Brett brought in is actually the mug in the movie. If you watch the movie, you'll see that every time they're set to fly in the officers club, the mug is turned with its face to the wall. If the face is to the wall, you're safe because you're not going out. When the adjutant came in or the operations officer came in and turned the mug around so that he faced out, that meant you were flying, and everybody then stopped drinking and got real serious because life was going to change for them over the next 24 hours. So when you see the mug, and that's how the movie starts. You have Harvey Stovall, the adjutant, who's now back being a lawyer again in the late 40s, goes by an English pawn shop or antique store and sees the mug in the window, goes in and buys it. The man says it's not worth much. He says, no, it's very precious, package it accordingly. And he takes the mug home with him, has it as he goes out to look at the Archbury, which is the base they use for this. And you see him standing there, which is Ozark, Alabama, which was overgrown at the time, looking at Ozark, Alabama before they actually cut the grass and then start doing their operations there for the movie. But that explains the mug. Okay.
Is the mug, a quick question, is the mug accurate was it actually in a movie, I mean in a bomber group?
What was the question, Chuck?
The question is this a real mug used by a bomber group, or did you find this? Where did you find this?
This was a mug made because of the movie. So the company that makes these have gone, the original mug was lost. The original mug was given to General Armstrong, and it was kept in his family for years, and then it has become lost.
See, I didn't know that. That's good to
The
know.
company went throughout the film, took all the close-ups, and redesigned the mug to the same height, dimensions, and colors, and they make these. It's made out in California.
Well, my question is, was this actually used in a real World War II?
Yes, that concept
Not this
of the mug
particular
in the
mug.
officers club is true.
It's true, okay, so many bomb groups
They had
use
different
that.
things.
Okay,
But, that was the deal.
thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
So you talked about being filmed in Alabama, but what percentage of the actual fighting scenes were true, were based on real combat? Were any?
Well, no. In the end of the movie, when you see the
Can you
oh, say the question. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
please.
The question was.
Question.
The question was, it was filmed in Alabama and so on, but what part of the combat footage you see at the end of the movie is real? That's real combat footage. When you see planes being shot at and German planes flying down and all, that's real combat footage taken by combat cameramen, either in the planes, especially when you see from behind, when you see a plane being shot at, that's actually a gun camera from a fighter instead of the bombers. But those are all.
Do you know what time frame that occurred? Because my dad was in the 91st bomb group. He was an A. When were those? Do you know when were those scenes?
Do not know. They were all during the question was when were those combat footage taken? It was all throughout the war and all parts of and it could not have, it may not even have been the European theater. It might even have been down in the Mediterranean at some point when they're seeing a plane shot down.
91st. So.
Well, you don't know. All it is combat footage that they were able to piece together to give you the feel. And they do a good job because the main actors are sitting simply on a sound stage, and they're having to act like, oh, hey, I'm getting ready to be shot at here. but then they take in and cut in the real footage, and here comes a plane diving through the formation. And if you're sitting on the edge of your seat in a theater, that can get you, if you're into that, you feel like you're right there. Yes, sir.
Other than the intentional belly landing, were there any accidents or mishaps in the filming of the movie?
Not that I'm aware of, that I found when I was doing my research for it. I didn't find anything where anybody, and this one was seriously hurt or anything like that. There was no mention of it.
Sure. One other question. You remember Turner was colorizing movies. Have you ever seen a colorized version of this?
I've never seen a colorized version. I don't know if this is one that would lend itself to colorization. The question was, has this ever been colorized? No, I don't think so. Has it been?
Yeah, but it did not get much success. People just didn't like it.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Was the airplane that was bellied in the beginning of the movie restored to flying condition, or did it scrap it?
I think the Air Force may have scrapped that. I don't know if they did. I'm not sure if he put it in the grass. You notice they didn't put it on the runway. They put it in the grass.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how much damage that would have done to it. I'm sure the ball turret on the bottom was not usable. I don't know if they tried to repair that or not, or they just wrote it off. They did give the 12 airplanes, and again, 5 of those had been in the bikini test, so they were had a lot of radioactivity with them, and so they had to limit the people who flew those to the amount of time they could be there for how many rads they were going to get from that radiation. Other questions?
You can watch the movie for free on YouTube. We watched it the other night.
Okay, good. That's good to know. Yeah, it's. I tell you what, it's. Even if you've seen it the first time, you'll see new things each time you watch it that you didn't notice before. And like I say, if you ever see Command Decision, it's a similar type movie, but it's all of a stage play and it's all talk at the higher levels. And this is about. The way they mix in the humor in this thing is pretty good. I always liked when Stovall's telling how he can keep the pilots there before that, because they all want transfers, and Gregory Peck says to him, "Well, you know, Harvey, there could be some real trouble in this." And he says, "I don't think so. I've never heard of a jury convicting the lawyer." So, so anyway, that's the kind of stuff you get in there, and you've got a. There's the another piece of the humor is the time all the ground crew, because the first time they go into Germany, they say, "Okay, we're going into Germany first time, Wilhelmshaven," which is a port in northern Germany, and they say that most of the ground crew tried to stow away. The doctor, the adjutant, the clerk have all stowed away, and so he says, "Okay, McEnany is always getting on Savage's bad side. He's a sergeant, so he says, 'Take your stripes off. You're back to being a private.' And then he'll do something. 'Okay, put your stripes back on.' And after that, Joe Cobb tells him, the operations officer says, 'Well, you know, you can bust him, but that might be a problem because he's born gunner, I guess. He's credited with 2 kills. And it says, it'd be hard when we give him a citation and the fact that we demoted him at the same time." So Savage sees McEnany again. He says, "McEnany, put the stripes back on. If we're going to keep having this, you better put them on with zippers." So. Any other questions?
Chuck, I will add, John just brought up something about the mug. The mugs go all the way back to, and they actually go back to World War I.
Oh.
The early World War I units started, they would do mugs. But today, present day, where maybe fact follows fiction a little bit, fiction that you got a B-17 here, you got the mug. John does a lot with the current 8th Air Force at Barksdale, the B-52 wing out there. The 2nd Bomb Wing.
The colonel in the 2nd Bomb Wing has that exact mug that he turns when B-52 assets are deployed around the globe on a mission.
Thanks for sharing that.
Okay.
Yeah, cool.
So the way you know is you're sitting in the club and somebody walks in and turns the mug around.
And Chuck, I guess also, we know this movie has been used at the Air Force Academy to teach leadership. Did you find out any other organizations?
The Navy used it as well,
okay,
to teach leadership. And they did that even into the 1960s, so it wasn't like they used it for a couple of years and discarded it. They were using it well into the Vietnam era. Okay. Any other?
John's got something else too. We share with me.
Yes, sir.
Bill Walsh, the famous coach of the San Francisco 49ers, made his entire coaching staff and players read 12 O'Clock High during their heyday, and it's in the book that he wrote called The Score Will Take Care of Itself. So, I mean, it's still being used today.
Yeah, okay.
Was the movie accepted well in 47, or was it,
Yes. Well, one of the things that, first of all, they had to fight to make the movie made. So they write the script and they've got the book, and the not Zanuck, but other, I guess the president of the company says, nobody wants to talk about World War II. That's 5 years ago. We don't want to, 4 years ago. We don't want to talk about that anymore. And the argument they used was, these guys have come back and they usually don't talk about it themselves. We needed something to tell their story. And by having this movie, it started dialogues with people about, what did you do in the war, Daddy, kind of thing. And that would allow people to open up, going like, that was real, or that looks really, that's the way it was, that sort of thing. It would bring that out that the people did not know before. And so, yeah, it was well accepted as, once they got in the theaters, and like I say, you go to the movie, it's only 25 to 50 cents to see this movie. And but it did start dialogues within families about what people were doing. Jeff.
Yeah, there was a question a while back about which gunner position was the most effective on a B-17. I don't know the answer to that question, but I do know the least effective gunner position, and that was the radio operator who would have a gun to the ceiling.
Yeah.
That is the worst position to be at to be in a plane. So by the end of the war, they were removing the machine gun out of the radio operators.
Right.
And you don't see the machine gun pointing up.
On this one, yeah, you don't see it. Yeah,
it was basically ineffective.
Yes, sir.
The most effective was the ball turret, because it had a complete 360 degree.
Well, the guns would go straight down and come up to level, and then as you come around, and then he had cutouts in that so he wouldn't shoot the propellers off and things like that. But, top turret probably similar.
Top turret too. Well, they got the spare room.
But the Navigator and the Bombardier, they had 250s that stuck out of each side of the nose in the F models, and they would even man those, and they could get a little bit of some shooting out that way if they saw a plane coming in. And then eventually the Bombardier was actually running that chin turret on the G models. And G models are most prevalent. And I'm sorry, yes ma'am.
Is it true that the fella in the bottom gunner, he had to be under 5 foot or so because it was a very small area?
I don't know if it was a requirement, but if you were much over 5'4", about 5'2", 5'4", you weren't going to fit. Because if you see the way that when you stepped in, you almost stepped in with your gun straight down, and you stepped in and your knees were kind of in this position. You sat like this, and you could look out right here. That's all you could see. And then the question was, what was the height requirement for the ball turret gunner? He had to be small because there's not much room in there. And also you can't wear the parachute. There's no relief in there, so you're in there for 6 hours. It could be a long time between bathroom breaks. So, and then to get out, you had to roll the guns they would go horizontal, or they would go all the way to the vertical, and you had 360 around that you could go, and with cutouts to keep you from shooting off the propellers. Anyway, to get out, you had to put those guns straight down. Somebody had to open the hatch behind you and help you out of that thing at the end of the tour. Yes, sir.
How did they operate the ball turret? With their feet, or turn and go left?
Right, it was electrical, and I guess they had a crank. Also, they could crank it around if they needed to, but primarily it was electrical. But if you saw the speed at which they showed one ball turret firing, he's actually getting on a gun, and it was also where his has thumb triggers, and then he's rotating the electrical like forward and back and left and right. But you're sitting in this really unnatural position. I mean, it's not like sitting in a chair. It's like laying on your back and having your legs straight out in front of you right here, and you're staying in that position for 6 to 8 hours. Now you're resting on the back of it, but your legs would go to sleep. You could, if you could get frostbite in your toes, for example, because you're hanging underneath this airplane at minus 50 degrees. So, yeah, not the best place in the world. They said it was one of the, I guess, Andy Rooney, who was a reporter for Stars and Stripes, later was on TV a lot. He was talking with somebody. Said that the guy went into the bar and was going to talk to a guy. Said, "I'll trade positions with you. I'm a sergeant." And the guy said, "Well, do I get the rank? You get the rank. You get the money. You just have to do the job." He says, "What's your job?" "I'm a ball turner gunner." The guy says, "Told him, oh, you can go to hell." I'm not doing that. Yes, ma'am.
Didn't the first astronauts have to sit like that?
That's pretty much like, but yeah, they would be in that position for the launch, and then of course once they got up, you're weightless and everything. But they had better foam. They had foam mattress-like things that they molded to them to fit them specifically to try to relieve some of that stress.
Probably not as cold either.
For them, no. But any other questions? Anyway, that's 12 o'clock high. Yes, sir.
That I shared with you earlier, back in either 2015 or 16, a good friend of mine was able to get the 4 fuselage from the movie 12 O'Clock High, the one they used for the actual TV show. And we got to go and help pick it up and bring it up to Suwanee, Georgia. And then it was transferred from Suwanee. He drove it all the way out to Los Angeles, where the last story we heard, it was supposed to be shipped to Israel, their museum.
Yeah.
Because after World War II, they used B-17s in their new Air Force.
Yeah,
they didn't have one in their museum. So at this point, I don't know if it made it there or not, but we were able to take 2 of our founding fathers, Henry and Albert, to go see the plane out in the parking lot in Lawrenceville in the Cracker Barrel. We got them inside. We got all kinds of pictures of it. It was almost a mistake getting them in there because we couldn't get them out. But it was pretty neat to see that.
Yeah. In case you couldn't hear, your question was there's some of the original planes that were used in this actually had the sides cut off so you could actually film into the plane, and that's now in Israel being restored.
Supposed to be shipped to Israel.
Okay, to be restored.
It was a conflict of customs. That's
Yeah.
what I remember. So somebody told me that it was at Chino, the Plane Museum, that they may have it now and restoring it for their
okay.
All right. But it was a neat treat to know that that was the actual plane that I grew up on watching the TV series.
Yeah, they did make a TV series out of this. There were comic books that were there. So 12 O'Clock High resonated with a lot of people, and it did tell a World War II story, 8th Air Force, that was unique, I guess, to all of the operation. Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you, John.